The CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. The presentation was delivered with slides. To view those slides, or to learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Hi everybody, my name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research in the Faculty of Arts and Design here at the University of Canberra. I'd like to start our proceedings by acknowledging that we are on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal peoples, the traditional custodians of the lands where this Bruce campus is situated. I want to acknowledge and pay respect to their continuing culture and to the many contributions they make to the life of Canberra here and to the region. And I'd also like to acknowledge all other Aboriginal people here in the audience, online, and throughout this country. And also acknowledge the fact that their sovereignty too was never ceded. So today is particularly special because we're hosting a stellar cast of authors and scholars to talk on a topic that is very close to the Centre's concerns. The event is called Knowing Where We Fit in the Australian Colonial Story. And I'm going to immediately hand over to Professor Kim Rubenstein, who is Adjunct Professor in the Canberra Law School. Kim is going to introduce the topic and the speakers. So please welcome her to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. And yes, just to reintroduce myself, I'm Kim Rubenstein, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session and to introduce my colleague, Professor Leanne Weber, who's sitting with me on the couch, but also to introduce our panellists who are also, in addition to Leanne, part of this panel today that we have been devising for some time. And I too want to join with Paul and the Centre in acknowledging the traditional owners, the Ngambri and Ngunnawal peoples, and in a way to reflect on this event itself as an affirmation of that important step of acknowledgement of reconciliation and indeed everything that we're seeking to talk about today and hoping to amplify in the broader community more broadly. And for that reason, I wanted to thank you, Paul, for your generosity of spirit in responding to the suggestion of Leanne and mine to host this or to manage this panel and to have an opportunity to meet with colleagues here at the University of Canberra, but also all of those of you who have joined online. For your information, the plan is, in addition to this being live recorded, that live streams, that there will be a recording and a podcast ultimately made from this. So not only those of you who get to experience this live, but hopefully for its ongoing educational and social impact in terms of what we hope to gain from talking today. So those of you who have responded to the this particular event will have seen on the notice, and I don't want to spend too much time, the eminence of my colleague, Leanne Weber, who is the author of this book, The Chosen Son, which I personally have found a very moving and enlightening and uplifting and thoughtful book, which we'll go into. And just as a little bit of a plug, knowing that authorship, as Kate also knows, is something that requires sales as well in terms of the ongoing, that there are actually books here for Leanne's books here in the room. And those of you who are online, it's easy to find it on Amazon and elsewhere without wanting to be too commercial. Not Amazon, sorry. No, go to the press itself. Go to Ginninderra Press if you are online. And also the wonderful Kate Grenville, who you can see on our screen and who's participating this hybrid sense. Kate is a well-loved and respected and eminent Australian author, and we are all very grateful for all of your work, Kate, but we're going to be drilling down today, of course, on this book, which I also have with me and which would promote you to go to Black Ink Books to purchase once you're inspired. If you haven't already read it, to be inspired by our discussion today, to engage with it. Each of us today are planning to contribute around the themes that you've seen reflected in terms of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians' engagement with the Colonial project, with its ramifications, and with each of our own places in that. And from my own perspective as an Australian citizenship scholar, as a constitutional lawyer, and basically as a basic active citizen, I feel that these questions are so fundamental to everything else that's going on in our country today, and perhaps that can be part of a broader discussion at the end. But given the context of this being a panel about these two books and the authorship of these two books, I'm going to start by asking each of the authors, and beginning with you, Kate, to reflect on your choice of genre for this book, Unsettled, because many of us in the room will be very familiar with your fiction, which of course also involves your family stories, but the motivation here to move into non-fiction, and I guess to share with us both that decision and the experience and the emotional experience, given it is about you and your family. So over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Kim. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation down in the south of the country, and to acknowledge the many hundreds of years, millennia, if I've got my maths right, of storytelling that must have taken place, perhaps on this very spot where I'm sitting. I'm just close to the Merry Creek, where I believe John Batman gave some blankets and a few bags of flour in exchange, he thought, for this piece of land. And I'd like to acknowledge well, look, the word that leaps to mind is horror of that, and the responsibility of we who have kind of inherited that colonial mindset, or those colonial actions, which is exactly what my book is about. Look, I've known for my whole life that, because my mother used to tell me family stories about my ancestors who go back to 1810. My ancestor, Solomon Wiseman, arrived as a convict and did very well, as most of them did, and spawned a huge family, of which I'm obviously one. I'd always known that, and it had always troubled me and gave me a sense of unfinished business. And when I did the Walk for Reconciliation, along with 30,000 other people across the Sydney Harbour Bridge in 2000, something focused in me, and I thought, my family story is part of a national story. I'm part of this, and I can't just dismiss it as family stories. I have a responsibility here. So I've been circling that idea and that kind of problem, really. It is a problem to be descended from the colonists for, since then, 26 odd years. And I have written fiction about it, The Secret River, The Lieutenant, Sarah Thornhill, and even A Room Made of Leaves, all circle that idea of we who have inherited that unhappy mantle from our invading ancestors, what do we do with that? So my feeling has always been that the thing I have to offer is to tell stories about it, to tell the story, and to try and tell it, first of all, as truthfully as I can, which of course has not always been done. I grew up in the 1950s when, the history of Australia started in 1788, according to what I was taught. So to tell the story truthfully, so that it actually includes all of the complexities, but also to try and tell it in a way that, if you like, I think of it as flying under the radar of people's resistance to thinking about what is in fact a very difficult and somewhat confronting subject. So the fiction was one way of doing that. And I've been taking notes about this for 20 years of a very personal nature, which I never thought of as being a published book. But after the defeat of the referendum, something in me caught flame, and I thought, no, I'm going to talk about this as myself, step out from behind the shield of fiction and talk about what it means to me, one individual and fairly kind of representative descendant of those colonists. So that's where the book Unsettled came from. It's a very personal, improvised, non-scholarly version of my journey through the places where my ancestors settled, which were all in northern New South Wales. I retraced the steps of my ancestors, and on each place I stood there and I thought, right, this is the actual land that my lot stole from the people who were here in the first place. And I hoped that that would progress my thinking or my feeling about it, and in fact it did.
Wonderful. Thank you. There are quite a few ideas there that I'm sure that we're going to come back to in our discussion, but we'll hold them there to move to you, Leanne. And in many ways, some people would say, well, how do these books come together? Because Kate has just explained she's gone back in the past and made a very deliberate step in relation to that historical journey and that historical analysis or experience, whereas yours is obviously your own personal history directly. And I'm wondering if you could also share with us how you came to your writing and the experience of producing this book.
So as Kim has hinted, my story is very close to home. So I think I probably have to just start with a little bit of background about my family. So my brother Len was fostered into our non-Indigenous family in the late 1950s in Adelaide, and I want to acknowledge the Kaurna people of Adelaide, which is the country on which most of the events covered in my book took place. He was about 2.5 years old and I was yet to be born, and that sequence of events was very important for me in understanding all that happened after that. He was born on the far west coast of South Australia. That's a colonial concept as it is, far, far from Adelaide, on a mission called Kunaba Mission to a very loving Gugara Wurrungu family. And I also want to pay my respects now that I know that that's where my brother came from. I didn't know that for most of my childhood and adult life. But the Gugara and Wurrungu people are still, as most other Indigenous groups today, battling a lot of colonial fights, and they have the misfortune of having Woomera on their land. So that is one of the sources of ongoing problems for them. Len would have just grown up with his family in hardship, but at least with his family, if it weren't for the fact that he was born with club feet. So it was Len's club feet that had him sent away for hospital care far away to Adelaide, and for years after for ongoing treatment. I now know, having read the Bringing Them Home report from the Stolen Generations inquiry, that was a fairly common pattern for Aboriginal children to be taken away, that their families would clearly consent to them travelling in order to get medical care, but would often never, ever get custody of them back. And that is what happened in my brother's case. So although there was a lot of love and care in our family, Len's life didn't turn out at all as any of us would have hoped. Once again, this is quite a familiar pattern that we can read in any of the material about the Stolen Generations and beyond. He began a heavy use of alcohol very, very young age. He began running away from school and from us, from our family home. Over time, police became involved. There were periods of institutionalisation in youth facilities, long periods away from home, from our home. And ultimately, many pointless and short-term imprisonments solely for his alcohol problem. Ultimately a degeneration, or over this whole period of time, really, the gradual onset of very serious mental health problems. So he eventually died a year before his 26th birthday, when he either fell or was pushed or possibly even jumped, we'll never know the truth, from a railway bridge in Adelaide. I didn't hear that terrible news until about a year later, as I was doing the rite of passage thing that we did back then in the late 70s, early 80s. I just graduated university and I was backpacking around the UK. These days, young people go to Asia, don't they? But I was in the UK trying to thumb lifts in the rain. And this would be unimaginable to young people today, but had no contact with home for the whole first month. Picked up my first post-restant letter when I returned to London and got this terrible news about what had happened to my brother. So by that stage, everything had been dealt with, and I was in a bit of a stunned state, but felt no desire to go back home. And so for a long time after that, for many decades, in fact, I think I probably just got a bit trapped within a sort of echo chamber of my own head that contained a lot of childhood emotions, a lot of unresolved grief, a lot of confusion and self-blame. So my motivation to write was to do with that. And I think it's summed up beautifully in just a brilliant sentence by Maya Angelou in her own memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And she said, "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." And so it was really just the need to externalize all that confusion and those feelings, although didn't work quite so much on the feelings level, but certainly to externalize all the thoughts and memories that I'd been holding for so long. And my understanding of what I was actually doing evolved a lot along the way. After a period of just thrashing about and disgorging a whole lot of confused thoughts, they crystallised into one central question: why was our family's love not enough? Why was that not enough to enable Len to survive? And even worse, I often saw it in terms of what I call in the book the love trap that we made for him. We loved him, and in some ways, perhaps that made things even worse. He was trapped inside our love trap, and I was convinced that that had something to do with him not being able to make his way in the world. But over time, I was much slower at this than Kate. I managed to connect the dots and see our family story as not just, the failing of our particular family, but as part of a much larger colonial story. And this was clarifying to me, if not entirely comfortable. It didn't sort of suddenly make me think, well, that's all okay then. It was very uncomfortable, and it still is, to have been part of the apparatus, to have been incorporated into the apparatus that took First Nations children away from their families. But it did help me to see, as I think Kate already alluded to, that all non-Indigenous Australians have a collective responsibility about this history, first to know it and then to understand our own particular place in it. And of course, around us these days, we see a lot of resistance to taking part in that. Finally, I think in the last stage of realisation, after I'd written the book, I got some wonderful and very helpful feedback from a fantastic Indigenous colleague of mine at Monash. I was formerly at Monash University, and she helped me see that the book had a wider application in terms of truth-telling, this process that we still so badly need to go through in this country, and also in accountability. It's a concept I wouldn't have thought of myself, but she saw the book as an act of accountability, and I guess that's why I'm here today. So thank you, Kim, and thank you, Paul, for enabling this to happen.
Thanks, Leanne. We might come back also to your place as an academic a little later in terms of the style and the the styles of writing in each of the books reflecting your own lived experience and I guess outlook on the world, which I think is also helpful for all of us in thinking through how we do participate in that project. I'll let the audience sort of let those percolate while I respond, perhaps engage with the three of you, both in terms of your sense of self and connection to story and the broader issue of bringing this to the people in a way. I mean, writing a book and bearing yourself and publishing it and putting it out for sale and then coming to these sorts of events is quite a brave step. I mean, Kate perhaps is more seasoned in relation to the years of doing so, but I think for all of us, even academics in the room, when we put ourselves out there with our scholarship, it's quite different to the very personal and raw experience that your book, Leanne, involves. And Mary, your response in terms of your own position and your own recognition of your duality of settler and Indigenous living together. That's essentially, in some ways, a representation of so much of the lived experience within the nation. But I wonder if I can just introduce, before I come back to you, Leanne, another level, which is what brought me to all of this and to my engagement with Mary as a colleague, is a notion of each of us, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, of our own place in community. And I use the language of citizenship, both because it's something that I think and write about as a legal scholar, but I think it's more than that for me. It's always been about my place as a member of a community. What are my responsibilities to myself as a human being to nurture and place myself in a position not only to look after myself, but to be responsible for others. As human beings, we are all relational, whether it be in our immediate sense of the families that we are born into, or to the communities that we identify with, or to the multiple and sometimes conflicting communities. And to me, I think what struck me about both of these books was that positive commitment of being an active citizen. It's something that I feel that all of us in varying ways, active doesn't necessarily mean the traditional, perhaps male archetype notion of being out there and being powerful in a sense that involves having power over others. One can be active in one's consciousness and reflectivity, but also in the way one talks to one fellow human beings, engages in a broader political project, not as in partisan political, but also as in being individuals, as members of a community where each of our actions impact on one another. And I guess for me, these two books both struck me as being works of major contribution of active citizens, reflective and hopefully encouraging all of us and all of us who have the opportunity to listen, to read or to engage in that personal journey ourselves of where we fit in terms of our relationships one another and the core start of the relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, as Kate's book so powerfully engages, as Leanne's book in terms of the stolen generation journey, and as Mary said, in the ever-present continuing project that we all are part of, whether it be the most recent experience of the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the Voice campaign, or the ongoing impact in so many different ways of what's happening. So that's my sort of little explanation, contribution in terms of the flow of ideas that we've generated so far. I'm conscious that we've got 20 minutes left, and I do want to be able to give both the audience here and also those of you in the audience online. Janvi here is going to monitor to see if any of you have questions online. So start to think about those, or even start typing them if you have them ready, so that Janvi can share them with us. But I just did want to come back to the fact that we are here in a creative and cultural studies centre, and the creativity of writing. And Leanne, to just come back to you, because you've done a lot of writing as an academic, but this is a different a different project, and the ways in which you incorporated both the academic in you, because that's who you are, and the human experience of you. Could you just say a little bit more about that?
Yes, I don't have Kate's gift of fiction, so that was never an option for me. But right from the beginning, it was clear that I needed to incorporate wider perspectives. And this is not a writer answering. This is someone grappling with their own feelings and experiences. I knew that it was necessary in order to understand and to get out of that echo chamber that I've been stuck in for decades, which had been very unproductive. I needed to inject, different ideas from different places. And some of the reading that I did included James Baldwin, and he's got a beautiful statement that sums it up really well. In Another Country, one of his novel, Another Country, one of his characters says, "The occurrence of an event is not the same as knowing what one has lived through." So I think even our own experiences can be enriched and better understood by contextualizing them within, the broader experience of others and different ways of understanding what we've been through. So in The Chosen Son, I'd say that the way it ended up, I wasn't the kind of writer that Kate is that would have a pre-planned idea about how to approach it. But the way that it ended up, I think it's primarily the narrative is driven by my own experiences. So that part of it is memoir. And when there are very striking experiences that I remember from childhood that are often very wrapped up in extreme emotion, because I think we all know now that we remember things better if they've been somehow attached to emotions, positive or negative. So those very raw and emotional parts of the book are generally represented in vignettes that are written in usually in the present tense to make it seem like it's being lived again. But that kind of material is very much contextualised within a range of other published sources, really eclectic. I mean, I used a little bit of history, not too much, a little bit of policy, not too much, some social analysis, but also very, very importantly engaged a lot with Indigenous authors, both of novels and of memoirs, that have been very, very important in how I came to understand and write about my own experiences. And also survivor testimonies. They were so very important, both from the Bringing Them Home report and from other collections of stories that are first-person experiences of survivors of these policies. Very important. But I want to give an example that's not related, that's not from an Indigenous author, because I think we've touched on it quite a bit, this moving away from, in my journey, from very strong feelings of individual guilt to understanding a broader collective responsibility. And I was completely helped in that transition by using the political philosophy of both Hannah Arendt and Iris Marion Young. Both of them discuss this at length, the distinction between these two things. They both exist. Mary's examined whether individual guilt it's not a productive kind of emotion, but we have it and it exists, and it's sometimes relevant and important. But collective responsibility is something very, very different. It means that as a society, because we have this collective life, we can choose to take on responsibility for harms that have been produced in our name in the past. It doesn't matter that we didn't individually commit those acts. That would be looking at it through the lens of individual guilt. And haven't we all heard a lot of loud voices in our society talking about it that way? We didn't do it, so it's not our fault. This is moving into a much more political way of looking at past harms and ongoing harms in terms of collective responsibility. So, I wouldn't have come up with these genius ideas. I would have been trapped in my own little echo chamber still if I hadn't used a lot of this other material.
Wonderful. Kate, I'm just wondering, having heard those two responses, whether there was something you wanted to add about the writing process itself. I mean, Mary's, shared some of those very powerful examples that you gave, but was this something that you did? Leanne sort of intimated you knew what you were going to be doing right from the start. Sorry, I'm looking around and at you at the same time. But was there an iterative, or is there anything that you would like to add about the actual writing process of this book compared to your fiction?
Oh, well, it's obviously, totally different. Although they're the same in the sense that I never know where I'm going when I start out, and that has always worked for me as a writer. So I don't plan. To me, the energy of the writing is the energy of a question, and that question often comes from some semi-conscious place, which is, I think what a lot of us colonial descendants feel. We have pressed down, I'm not sure about the word guilt, but we have a discomfort. There is an area in our existence and our place in the world that we're very uncomfortable about, unsettled about. And it's very difficult to live with that kind of discomfort. So we kind of press it down. So it's out of that pressed down bit, which is that kind of it's asking a question that you don't know the answer to and you don't really even want to ask it, which in the case of my book, for example, was what does it mean to be a non-Indigenous Australian? What rights do I have? What responsibilities do I have? All too hard. So you tend to sort of squash it down and think, oh, well, just move along. But I think that actually the best books come out of that squashed down bit. If you look at it too closely and too kind of, sort of distant, rational way, you may not actually burrow down to that unconscious place. So the fiction also started from that unconscious place of thinking, what was it like? I mean, the question behind The Secret River is, if I had been my ancestor in 1810, landing for the first time on the bank of the Hawkesbury River and saying, right, this is going to be mine. Doesn't seem to be anybody living here. I'm going to own it now. What happened? What did he feel when, having established himself there, some local people, Aboriginal people, came and talked to him? What actually happened in that interaction between the two of them? Now, that's a very uncomfortable thing to think about, and for a long time, the book had to circle around it in different ways. And Unsettled is the same thing. When I was researching The Secret River and some of my other books, I travelled to a lot of the places where the family story had happened. Wiseman's Ferry on the Hawkesbury is the main one. So I had visited them in, say, the year 2000, 2001, and made a lot of notes, which went into the novel. But when I went back 20 years later to write Unsettled, or to at least think about Unsettled, I could see what I'd missed, and I could see why I'd missed it, because it's very uncomfortable living with that. So what I wanted to do in the book was to enter the discomfort, to stop evading it, not to kind of take it on as a kind of burden, but to think, okay, let me use this discomfort as a way of opening up this question so that instead of putting it in the too hard basket, let's just get it out and look at it. And that is what I would hope that readers might take away from it too, to think, okay, here is this stuff that there is, as Mary said, no answer about that. There's no solution. There's no resolution. We simply have to accept that this is who we are. This is the legacy we have. We have to live with it and go on knowing that that is our responsibility.
Well, in that state of discomfort, I'd love to open the floor to further discomfort or engagement. Maybe that's the more appropriate, which may involve different types of emotion. And Paul is very helpfully standing there with a microphone. So if there's anyone in the room themselves here now who would like to ask a question or raise a comment also that you've reflected on from your own experiences, I encourage you to show your hands. There's one, Paul, up the back then. If you'd like to introduce yourself too, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Fee. I'm an HDR student.
Great.
Also writer. Which will come into my research. I'm really interested. Hey, you spoke about this squashed down place, which I'm really fascinated with because so many reasons. I'm working from a disability perspective of disability within the arts, and some of the questions we're afraid to ask there as well. And I, as a writer, I know that so much of what we read as an audience is about what we as writers have chosen to take out or leave in the book. And so when we're working through and writing from this squashed down place, obviously there's a heck of a lot of like reflective stuff that just never makes it into the book. But what is it, do you think, that guides your choices in what we leave in and what we take out towards a finished product, especially when so much of this squashed down place is so very, very difficult not only to process but to read and to hear when we're talking about resistance as a form in itself?
Great.
Yeah, it's a really good question and a really central problem, really, when we're dealing with this kind of stuff. Look, to me, the only thing is if you're going to actually harness the energy of the squashed down place, I mean, I picture it like a spring. There's a lot of kind of potential energy locked into that spring. So let's use it. So let the spring explode. Let all the stuff out onto the paper. And only when you feel you've kind of got it out, then start the gradual process. I should say that I wrote something like 24 drafts of Unsettled. And for me, that's quite normal for a book. That's how long it takes to work out the problem that you're asking about. What should I leave in and what should I take out? You can only do it by trying. It's experiential. You can't work it out in theory, I don't think. You have to physically, and computers have made this much easier, see what it looks like with all that stuff in, see what it looks like with none of it in, and go on from there. But I think the first thing is to let it all out, not thinking about anybody reading it, so that you have the full, you've accessed the full energy of the squash, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Leanne.
In my case, the squash down part, a lot of it was within my own family. And so that raises another series of, very specific questions. I didn't write the book until after my parents had died, not deliberate really. That's just the sequence of events. It took that long for me to have the courage and the space to be able to start to write it. But of course, as I was writing it, I wanted so much to be authentic and honest, my view of what was honest, that I knew that my family would be affected and also my brother's family, although they're not identified. So that was a particular issue for me, and lots of stuff went in and lots of stuff came out. It's very reassuring to hear that that's what Kate did as well. I didn't want it to be a trauma memoir, and I'm not denigrating that genre absolutely at all, but because I also wanted to, it's awkward, it's a memoir, and yet it's not entirely about me, it's about my brother. It's about my relationship with my brother. So a trauma memoir about me would not have been the right thing. A trauma memoir about him would have been me presupposing what his feelings were, which I didn't have access to that or entitlement to write that either. So that was difficult, and I did give early drafts to family members. That was an interesting exercise, and long story about how all that has worked out, but discomfort just covers everything, I think. It's very uncomfortable, the whole thing. But what I hadn't expected was that the second part of the book, which I don't mention much when I talk about the book, was really a journey of reconnecting with my brother's family, and also just learning what my responsibilities were from their point of view as well, which was very interesting. And in fact, they at first were quite concerned about what I'd written in the memoir, which was very worrying and difficult for me. And we talked and worked through, and it turned out it was how I'd represented my own family they were concerned about, not about somehow it being, disrespectful to a First Nations point of view. So you can't know how people are going to respond. And if they're people close to you, you need to work through it. If they're people not close to you, then you just have to take it on the chin, I guess.
Over to you, Paul. Are there some questions there?
Well, this is a comment rather than a question from Lorana Bartels. saying hello from a fellow Justice Reform Initiative patron. And she thought the group would like to know that this Tuesday, as always, Lorana opened her Punishment and Society course at ANU with the opening paragraph of The Secret River.
Ah, there you go. Great.
I
think there's a question up the back.
Kim up the back.
Yeah, Kim Horn.
Thanks, everyone. Kate, I know in your book you talk about the possibility of having a term like pakia in New Zealand for white folks in Australia. And Mary, you picked that up briefly and said that you weren't necessarily in favour of that and wanted to interrogate and use settler and other terms more. Perhaps you could just elaborate, both of you, on what's going on there. And what about more new arrivals too? What word should possibly we use for recent migrants? Thanks very much.
Look, I'll jump in very, very quickly. First of all, I think we're all in the same boat, whether we arrived in 1788 or yesterday, in terms of being, Balanda was the word that I picked, descendants of settlers. Look, I really wanted to. A lot of the book Unsettled is about interrogating the words that we use without thinking about them, like settler, for example, or explorer, or took up land. We use these phrases that become kind of automatic. So one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to say, let's actually stop and think about the words we use, because that will burrow down into what we're actually thinking. So yes, I can see all the problems with the word balanda, but it seemed to me an interesting exercise to take a couple of pages to think about all the alternatives, what we do call ourselves, what we might call ourselves, what other people might call us, and just to kind of open that up to bring it to consciousness is really what the book was about. And the word balanda was perhaps part of that.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm conscious that it is actually exactly 1 o'clock now. So to be entirely rigid with our timing, anyone who needs to leave is free to leave. But if there is anyone who did want to ask another question or make a contribution before we call it a day here, is there anyone? Yes, Paul.
Yeah, I couldn't help reflecting from what you were saying before, Kate, and the way that the other speakers took it up, whether question is a better word than fiction.
Okay, to describe a book, yes, I'd be quite happy with that. Yes, a question, The Secret River, a question asked by Kate Grenville. Yeah,
Yes,
I think that's
yeah.
because I think all of the best writing springs out of what you don't know. That's my starting point. Because if you don't know, you're going to be interested, and that will give a kind of impetus and an energy towards truth telling. Which if you think you already know the answer, it's a kind of a bit flaccid very often. So yeah, I love that idea.
Can I thank you on behalf of all of us here for your participation today? And maybe I formalise it here and allow you, Kate, to move away from your screen. But thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this very stimulating and hopefully ongoing project. And of course to my dear colleague Leanne sitting right next to me, can you all in this room join in thanks for our panelists today? Thank you. And perhaps Paul, do you want to just we'll let each of our Zoom and all the Zoom participants who are flying away and the various thanks that we can see there. Thank you to all of you. We might end off the Zoom now. Thank you also to all of the participants. And
Thank
Paul,
you for
I'll let
making
you
it
speak
happen.
to those here. Bye-bye.
Well, thanks to you, Kim, for just an extraordinary session that's really just been stunning.